Hello and welcome to the KOFISI Connect podcast, your source for a wealth of roundtable discussions on the workplace, business, as well as cultural news and trends from the diverse and dynamic continent of Africa. I'm your host, Georgia Webber. In advance of our screening of Mo and me about the infamous Kenyan photographer Mohamed Amin on the 9th of May, we're talking to his son, Salim Amin. Welcome. Who's now looking after camera pics and the archive of his father's 3 million photographs. I mean, that's extraordinary. Wowee. What's the period that they were kind of taken over?
So the images that he took were from the late 1950s to the time of his passing in 1996, in the mid-90s. But he also accumulated a lot of other content from the early 1900s, the late 1800s, early 1900s, that period especially of cities developing like Nairobi and others. I'm not sure where he got that content from or how he got his hands on it, but we have, sort of Nairobi in the 1900s, early 1910s, 20s. Other cities like Dar and other places, the Mau Mau struggle for independence. We've got all that content, both stills and footage. So you mentioned the 3 million, but it's also about 20,000 hours of footage as well.
Amazing. And so where did he start? Where did he learn to be a photographer? How did his journey begin?
So he was born in Eastleigh in Nairobi, and my grandfather came to build the railway, like many Asians from the subcontinent were brought by the British to build the railway. So he was based here initially. Dad was born here, and then my grandfather was transferred to Dar es Salaam.
Okay.
So Dad grew up in Dar. And when he was in high school, he was 12 or 13 years old, he borrowed a friend's camera. And I think it was a bit of a more financial decision, economic decision, rather than a sort of anything passion related.
Yeah.
But he realized that no outside photographers were allowed into the school to photograph school events. Right. Plays, sports, festivals, etc. Okay. So he realized if he could take some of these pictures, he could sell them to the newspapers and make 2 shillings, 5 shillings, whatever it was. So that was how he started. And then I think as he borrowed this friend's camera and friend's father's camera actually, and the friend got a beating when his father discovered that his camera had been taken. But he realized that he kind of enjoyed telling people's stories.
Right.
And he had a little darkroom. He built his own little darkroom in the school. And so he would he learned how to process film and do that. And that's where it all started. He was 12, 13 years old. And
then the journalism aspect, where did that kind of come from?
I think that was
money.
I don't think it was.
Living.
It wasn't so much money. I mean, he had a great, again, by that time he was 16, 17. Okay. And he developed a passion for wanting to tell stories. And he knew that, obviously, this was the time that this region was becoming independent. And so he knew that this was, there was a lot going on. And there weren't many other foreign journalists around. So he had an opportunity to be able to make money, right, but also to tell sort of exclusive stories. And he just dropped out of school because he realized that, whatever they were teaching him in school was never going to make him a better photographer. And he dropped out, much to the disgust of my grandfather, who didn't believe that photography was a profession. It was like, in those days, even now, if you were of Asian background, you had to be an accountant or a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer. Photography was just a pastime.
Wow.
So him and my grandfather didn't really see eye to eye on that. But he dropped out and started photographing sort of this wave of independence coming, especially in Tanzania.
Because, I asked that only because I was a former journalist, and I think that some of the I certainly remember, obviously, the famine in Ethiopia and the Rwandan genocide. Some of those images, me seeing in the news items, in the UK, growing up there, most of which, or all of which, your father would have.
Well, yeah, any major story in the 20th century in this part of the continent was covered by him. The Zanzibar Revolution was the first big story that he did. Again, he was 20 years old. Got from his contacts, and from a very early age, he had built this black book of contacts that was really interesting and useful. But he found out from one of his contacts that there was going to be a coup attempt in Zanzibar.
Wow.
And, he managed to get a dhow to get across from Dar to Zanzibar, and again filmed and photographed this whole, this Ugandan mercenary called Johnny Okello taking over, overthrowing the Sultan of Zanzibar and taking over the island. And it was amazing footage, and all the British families fleeing. There was I think it was HMS Destroyer, one of the warships was actually brought to Zanzibar to evacuate all these people, and he managed to get exclusive content of that. And that was when he was only 20. But then Zanzibar became sort of this, as did most of East Africa, this battling ground between East and West. So the Soviets were trying to get in, the Americans were trying to put influence in. And on one trip, when again a year or so after the attempted the coup, he went into to film a land redistribution ceremony that they used to do where the Zanzibar government was redistributing land to peasants, to some of the peasant farmers. And so he went there and noticed this, as he was driving to the ceremony, he noticed this new kind of road in the jungle, going through the jungle. So he went down it because he had heard rumors of the Soviets building a missile base on Zanzibar, and East German instructors and trainers training Zanzibari soldiers. So he drove down this thing, and sure enough, there was this camp at the end of it, which was a training camp filled with Soviet advisors and East German advisors. And he just started filming. And nobody paid any attention to him for a while. And he just went around filming, photographing, doing his... from an early age, he had learnt this trick of shooting only a few shots on his camera, and then putting the film and marking it unexposed, and then changing roles very quickly and marking that unexposed. So eventually one of these guys saw him and was like, who the hell are you? And he said, well, I'm just waiting for the land redistribution ceremony to start, so I'm just shooting some things around. And they're like, this isn't where this land redistribution is, and so they, put a gun up his nose and told him, he's like, look, at least let me keep he unwound his roll, gave them the film, and said, let me keep my unexposed rolls here. You can take these other rolls, but I need something, otherwise I'm going to lose my job if I can't cover the redistribution. It's my mistake, I'm sorry. And they fell for it. And he went, and this footage and these pictures were used by JFK to negotiate with Khrushchev on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Wow. Because the Soviets were denying that they had any...
He knew something was up.
And so, but then the KGB, because at that time Viz News and the other agencies used to put out the footage to all their clients, and they would put the name of the photographer or the cameraman on the dope sheet that went out, the log sheet. And TASS, which was the Russian news agency, was one of their subscribers. So TASS picked this up, saw the name of the photographer, and sent it to their KGB counterparts in Zanzibar, and said, this is the guy that filmed this, because the Soviets were very embarrassed by this whole thing. Yeah. So the next time he didn't have any wind of this. The next time he went to Zanzibar, a couple of months later, it was for a visit. I think it was Nasser of Egypt was coming to visit. And at the airport, these guys just came up to him and said, oh, you Mr. Amin, we want to just show you the arrangements for filming this. Put him in a car, and he was taken to Kilimamigu prison, which was a maximum security prison, run by the KGB. Rumored that it was Putin that was his jailer, because Putin had just become the head of the Africa KGB in Africa. This was his first posting when he was just a teenager or just out of his teens. And he was tortured for 30 days in Kilimamigugu, beaten, tortured every day, and eventually, and given pills, and he doesn't know what he was given. And this is when he was 22 years old now. So eventually he was released because there was pressure from the agencies and others, but on the condition that he would be deported from Tanzania. And he left, just got on a plane and came to Kenya.
And so then carried.
Had to start again, to start his business again.
And he carried, you see, for me, it's quite difficult to separate the photographer from the journalist there, because, you talk about the little black book and et cetera, et cetera. He was very much a journalist as well as a photographer. He didn't write much. He didn't sort of file any content. There were always, he would just do sort of captions for his pictures. But being the key, the key connection to a lot of the stories. How do you think his pictures may have kind of influenced global awareness and of Africa? Would you say?
I think
of what's going on
in the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s. The Idi Amin years. He had exclusive access to Idi, so he photographed and filmed all of Idi's executions and all of this stuff. So that obviously shaped an opinion of Idi globally. He was seen as this butcher and dictator, which he was, but he was also a buffoon, and the famous pictures of him in the swimming pool and all that were all dad's,
which were taken
stuff.
by your father.
Yeah, all that. Last King of Scotland was based on Giles Foden spending time with my father and learning about Idi Amin before he wrote the book. And then Tom Mboya's assassination here in Kenya, that also shaped a lot of policy going forward for Kenya and shaped the history of the country, changed the history of Kenya, because Mboya was probably going to be the next president of Kenya after Jomo Kenyatta, and his assassination again changed this country probably for the worse. And then the Ethiopian famine of '84 was his biggest story.
Yeah.
And again, what that did is it gave people the impression that Africa was just this continent of starvation and death and the dark continent. And it took almost 30, 40 years after that for people to change their perception of the continent.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of a sort of a reverse backlash against Live Aid, and because of what sort of happened,
and he never apologized for that, because this was news. It was not. He was not making up these stories. So there was famine and genocide and war, but what he didn't have at his disposal was the internet. Unfortunately, all the international broadcasters that he worked for were only interested in stories of genocide, famine, and war. They didn't want, sort of nice, positive stories. But he then did a lot more photography work covering the beauty of the continent. So in his lifetime, he published over 75 coffee table books, looking at the beauty of the people, the cultures, the flora, the fauna of the different countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, in order to try and balance the picture. So he knew he was responsible for the negative image, but he also knew that if those stories had not been told, then in Ethiopia's case, 5 million people would have died from that famine if those pictures never came out. In the end, 1 million people died, which is still 1 million too many, but 4 million people were saved, and it changed. It also led to the overthrow. Eventually, 5 or 6 years later, the overthrow of Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam, who was the sort of de facto dictator of Ethiopia at that time. It led to his overthrow, and it led to a whole transformation of Ethiopia over 2 or 3 decades.
I think it was the Live Aid song, actually, which wasn't your father's fault. It was, the whole... Do
they know it's Christmas? Yeah, the Band-Aid song of that. Look, we can, in hindsight, is a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
But, Bob Geldof stood up and did something. And for me, that makes him all right. There was none of this sort of political correctness of why is a white man saving Africa. No, he saw something that he thought was unacceptable and decided to stand up and do it. A lot of other people saw it, they didn't do anything. But he did it, whether he was misguided, naive, however that might be seen.
And something changed.
Something changed, people's lives were saved. And for that, I don't think anybody could ever criticize Bob for that.
You mentioned Idi Amin. There are some other leaders in his archive as well. How was he either always in the right place at the right time, or how did he get on with these leaders, or what was it in his personality, do you think, that kind of allowed him such candid access?
I think it was a combination of a few things. One, many of the leaders he had seen growing up. So he was also in school with some of them. He also photographed some of them before they became leaders, got to know them. And one of the things that was quite extraordinary about him is he treated everybody exactly the same. It didn't matter if you were a prince or a president or, someone that was a driver or a cook or whatever. He treated everybody exactly the same. And he didn't see any difference in them. And I think over time they realized that he was just doing his job, and he would portray you as accurately without any bias. He tried to be as objective as possible and just photograph and film what he saw. He never put an opinion behind it. And I think they respected him for that. And the more famous he grew in terms of how he did, the more access he got to some of these people as well. And but he never compromised in terms of his telling of stories. He would suck up to the dictators when it was necessary for him to get access that other people didn't help, but he wouldn't not broadcast damning images just because he wanted to save somebody some embarrassment or anything like that. And that got him into a lot of trouble as well. He was jailed numerous times. He was blown up. He was shot at. He had survived 18 car crashes, 7 plane crashes.
Wow.
He had a pretty interesting life.
And was he being targeted, or
no? I think it was just random events, but it was part of the job of going to these remote and very difficult places and getting in and out of them. You had accidents, and he was more accident prone than most. Losing his arm, and it was all over. And that isn't even considering the regions of kind of conflict and instability that he. How many wars did he cover? I would have to say it would be in the dozens.
Wow.
And it was not just Africa. He was not just sub-Saharan Africa. This is what always shocks us when we go through the archive. It wasn't just the region, it wasn't just East Africa that was his patch. He was down south in Mozambique, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Zambia. He was in West Africa. He did Biafra and Nigeria, and covered Ghana and other places. Then he went as far away as Afghanistan. Spent time with the Mujahideen there in the 80s. Spent 6 months with the Mujahideen in the 80s. He was in Pakistan. He was in Bangladesh, what was then East and West Pakistan, that conflict in the 70s, which became Bangladesh eventually. He was there. So he was everywhere. Middle East. He was the first person. He was the first cameraman into Iraq in the first Gulf War.
Wow, I didn't know that.
So he went. He was everywhere. He just managed to get into all of these places, and it was because I think it was also because he was really a global citizen.
Yeah.
His color allowed him to get into certain places. Yeah. It restricted him from other places as well. Going and working in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. He would go, and his colleague, who was his sound man, was actually a white British guy, and the people would only talk to him. They would completely ignore my father, completely. And the guy would be like, well, I'm not the boss. This is the guy that's the boss. You need to talk to him. They would not address him at all. So he grew up in these very interesting situations, and it honed his character.
And in the world of, you mention his name, and it is, I mean, even somebody said, love your father's book or your book, just coming in. I mean, you know, it is, he's made an impact in the world of not only journalism, but also photography itself. How would you say that he's inspired others?
I think, I mean, I get a lot of young journalists that have come to me and said that his story has inspired them to get into this profession, to that. So I think, you know, I don't think he started out wanting to inspire anybody, but his story did. And you know, even while he was alive, I was very surprised when he died about the amount of correspondence and letters and stuff I received from people I'd never heard of or never met, but young journalists that said, you know, if we ever met him in the field or in his office, he would always spend a lot of time with us and give us advice and talk to us and do that, and it was hugely inspiring. So it's a part of him I never saw. It's a side of him that I never saw because he never gave me that time or advice or anything like that. So, but he did do it for a lot of people, and I think even when he was young, he got shafted by a lot of people. A lot of older journalist photographers saw him as a threat, so they didn't help him and they gave him bad advice and they and tried to mess him up and his work up. And he, I think, at that point said, you know, I'm never going to do that to young people. If anyone wants to learn, then I'll go out of my way to teach them.
That is the cutthroat world of journalism.
And he was as ruthless. He was as ruthless as anybody. As somebody, one of the, I think it was Colin Blaine of the BBC, said to me, you know, he wouldn't piss on you if you were on fire, if it was a competitive situation. In Ethiopia, when they were covering the fall of Addis in 1991, you know, he had managed to get a flight in from Nairobi with Colin Blaine and others. He was already in Addis. And the only reason he got permission for that plane to land was so that that pilot could take back his footage to Nairobi for it to be broadcast, because there was no satellite access in Ethiopia in those days. And then the CNN Gary Stryker was the CNN correspondent, and he showed up at the airport and he was giving his tapes to the pilot as well. And Dad just took his tapes and threw them out and said, this is my plane and only my tapes will go out. Wow. It was completely ruthless. Very different business now. Everyone pools their footage and everything. But in those days, he was like, no, I brought this plane here. Only my stuff is going out. You can find your own way.
So what do you think he would have thought of the emergence of kind of fake news and AI? What do you think he would be saying now?
I think he would be very disappointed that journalism has gone to where it's gone now. When you look at how biased the media has become globally, from when he was operating. You look at how Fox News and CNN and BBC and Al Jazeera and all of these all have agendas. Everybody's got an agenda now that's bigger than just covering the stories. And I think he would have been very disappointed. I think he may have seen social media as a way for him to tell his stories rather than working for a big media organization. Maybe he would have transitioned away from those mediums and gone on to the new platforms. AI, I'm sure he would have figured out ways to make it work for him, and adapt to it, because AI needs content, and he was a master at accumulating content. So I'm sure he would have figured out ways. But I think he would have been disappointed with the standards of journalism now in the world, and the fact that so much is fake and so much is manipulated in order to serve a particular agenda. And
that you're allowed to have the platform to kind of even purport your, incorrect views. Yeah. So as a father, what was he like? And how would you, your knowledge of kind of, history, 20th century African history is extraordinary. Do you think you'd have had that without, or are you just generally interested in the subject?
No, I don't think I would have had that without having access to this content. I went to school, here in Nairobi, primary school, high school, never learnt a single sentence of Kenyan history or African history. These were British curriculum, so we learnt about Henry VIII and the Tudor eras, and completely useless information. So I don't think I would have ever learned that, and had that passion for this without this content to be able to refer to. And so he didn't, to be honest, I hardly saw him when I was growing up.
Yeah.
Because he was everywhere, covering everything, we hardly saw him at home, my mum and I. So I didn't really know him as a father. When I made Mo and Me, it was in order for me to understand him. I could have spent 3 years with a shrink and gone through that, or made a film. And the shrink would probably have been cheaper. But it took me 3 years to make Mo and Me. And it made me understand him and appreciate him a lot more. I think there were a lot of issues between us that were never resolved because he died, very suddenly. Yeah. And I was only 25 years old when he died. And I think both of us assumed we'd have a lot longer together to resolve those issues. Yeah. So finding out about him and learning about him through other people that knew him better than I was a very cathartic experience for me. But I also learned to appreciate his passion and understood that you can't do what he did without sacrificing a huge part of your life. And unfortunately, the sacrifice was the family.
Yeah.
That was what he had to give up in order to achieve that. And I didn't understand that until I made that documentary and until I actually understood what he did. Now I see what he's done because I've seen the content and what he's left, and hopefully this content can somehow be made available to schools around the continent, around the world, so that young people can learn this
about
history.
A relevant history.
Absolutely.
Not King Henry.
Yeah, and even, British, American, European kids should learn about the history because they've had such a huge influence on this continent from a colonial perspective.
Yeah.
So we want to make this stuff available, and I think it'll change a lot of people's perceptions about the continent.
Amazing. Well, if you want to see Mo and Me, we're having a Q&A with Salim as well on the 9th of May at KOFISI 9. I can't wait to talk to you again then.
Looking forward to it.
And we will see you then.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.